Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. This is Christy Arsenault welcoming you to the session, and I think we've got a really interesting presentation lined up by Brad Wasson of NB Power.
Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today, actually, and I have to say that in the work that I do at NB Power, I have had a number of interactions with the Quest people before, and what an awesome organization it is. And I think of the myriad of things that Quest is involved with, one of them that I think is just so critical to our world today is to build the literacy level around energy in our society. We are in a wholesale transformation of the world of energy. I think we all sense that as people that live in New Brunswick, but if you live anywhere in this world, regardless what your community is, where it's located around the globe, understanding energy issues, energy futures, where things are going across the broad gamut, not just electricity, which will be my focus today, but the full world of energy, which Quest does cover, the full world of energy. And I mean, it's just such an exciting time. There's so much happening, but building literacy is critical for people to have a true understanding of the issues that are out there and what some of the solutions and way forward is. So in my presentation today, what I'd like to cover is a little bit about the history of the electricity utility, because it gives some context for how we are changing. And I'm going to present the change in the form of 5 paradigm shifts that we're observing in the world of the electric utility. And then I'm going to finish by talking about some of the things we've been working on for the last few years, where we're headed with our programs, and what the future might hold for people in New Brunswick that use electricity. So with that, I'm just going to, maybe just before I get into the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what my role is. I'm a director at NB Power. I'm responsible for a couple of different things. At strategic program we have called Reduce and Shift Demand. Myself and another director are jointly responsible for this program in the company, and I'm also responsible for the product development group, which I'll be touching on a little bit later in the morning. So many of you probably on this webinar will have met Michel Logier in the past. He's the director of community engagement at NB Power, and certainly between Michel and I and a number of other directors in the company, we are kind of building and telling the story about the changing utility. And we would all have perhaps somewhat unique perspectives and different experiences and work-life knowledge to bring to the table. So you'll hear slightly different perspectives on the changing utility, and that's good. It's always good to hear different perspectives and understand that it is a world of transformation, and there are some unknowns about how this is all going to unfold. I want to take you back to science in high school for a second and just mention that the world of electricity really begins with this mysterious thing called an atom, which has a number of elements inside it. One of the elements inside is this amazing thing called an electron. And probably at least 300 years ago, people started observing the impact of electrons, although we really had no idea 300 years ago what these electrons were, but we could certainly observe static electricity. In fact, I like to tell the story that the last couple hundred years there's been magicians that would have made a livelihood or made a living from going around and illustrating feats of static electricity, and no one could actually figure out how it worked, but it was simply the observation of the world of magnetism and electricity at play. And so interestingly, although we haven't understood much about the atom, in fact we really didn't understand how it worked in detail until about the mid-1940s or so, but over the last 300 years we've certainly learned a lot about this amazing thing called the atom and the properties of it, and we've been able to harness the power of it. In fact, around 1880, Thomas Edison in the United States, who had been experimenting with electricity, and there's a number of people, scientists before him, of course, that were paving the ground to this. But one of the neat things that Edison had done, Thomas Edison here in this picture, had created one of our very first distribution systems where he literally connected a number of light bulbs to a wire, and we're able to light them up, and that really was the forerunner of what today we would call our transmission and distribution system. So the principles have been around since the late 1800s. You know, and I'll just quickly mention that one of the fundamentals of are some very relatively simple properties. So if we spin magnets around a wire, particularly a wire that's wound around some sort of a core piece of material like metal, you wind it around a core, and then you spin magnets around it, you can induce those electrons to travel down a wire. And so a lot of the last 100 years has been focused in electric utilities about experimenting with different ways to create electricity effectively. And for the most part, I think about 90% of the electricity produced in North America comes from spinning a turbine that spins magnets around a wire and creates this electricity. And so turbines are a very, very important part of the electrical system that we've had for the last 100 years. And it turns out that one way that you can spin turbines is by compressing steam around a set of fins, as illustrated in this diagram here. So compressing steam and spinning a turbine can actually induce electrons to flow down a wire. So one of the questions is, well, how do we produce steam? Because if we can get steam to turn the turbine, where does the steam come from? And that very much is the subject matter of how do we produce steam by either burning things or managing a nuclear process or some other mechanism in order to generate heat. And so much of the story of electricity in the last 100 years has been around how do we build facilities typically based on burning some sort of a fossil fuel in order to generate heat and steam to turn a turbine and transmit electrons. And for the most part, over the last 100 years, utilities have been in the business of siting generation stations in strategic locations in order to generate electrons and transmit them from the generation source to where people actually use electricity. We call that the load on the system, the total electric use, or the load. And the action of the customers asking for electricity to serve their needs is called demand. So essentially, if you think back over the last 100 years or so, and think of yourself as a person living in the early 1900s, around 1920 is an important date in the history of electricity, because here in New Brunswick we wrote the very first Electricity Act. And essentially what the Act was looking at was it was a government initiative in order to understand the problem of how would we make this wonderful phenomenon called electricity available to everybody in the province, both residents and businesses, so that they can leverage this in their day-to-day lives in order to make economic prosperity in the way we lived, and to enable the world really as it's transpired to what we have today. You know, telecommunications, lighting, video, basically the house system, everything that we can think of today is underpinned by this phenomenon called electricity. So in 1920, the government of the day was thinking about this problem, and they were really thinking about where is the demand, so where are people living in the province, how much demand or what is the load on the system going to be at those locations, and what kind of infrastructure and what fuel ultimately will be needed to securely satisfy that demand for electricity. And this is really kind of a key part of understanding the transformation we're going through now is, and I would say it this way, that electrical providers like NB Power over the last 100 years have been infrastructure builders and managers. So we have been people that have built physical infrastructure, poles and wires and substations and generation plants, etc., in order to first generate electricity from the electrons, transmit them over wires, and get them to where the people are. And the Act of 1920, the Electricity Act of 1920, which has been updated about 3 times in the last 100 years, but more or less has said the same thing, established what's known as a social compact between the people, the government, and the utility. And essentially the thinking was in 1920 that there would be no private sector organization out there that was capable of investing the capital dollars needed to build the infrastructure without it being a government-led or enabled organization. So they created the New Brunswick Electric Power Commission in 1920, which is now known as NB Power, and they set up the social compact. So the government gave the utility access to capital dollars at really attractive rates to build infrastructure to serve electricity to the people, and they established some checks and balances in the system. And those checks and balances include establishing a regulatory oversight entity that would ensure that the rate that was charged for the electricity, because it was done essentially in a monopolistic fashion, would be fair and equitable for everybody. So that model is really based on what we call the regulated rate of return, or cost recovery, and it's based on the total cost of service provision. And this model, the social compact established in 1920, essentially based on a model that is quite easy to understand when you see it written like this. So here's a bit of a mathematical equation. No test on this, so don't have to worry about that. But essentially, if we total up the cost of the infrastructure, so see the icon representing a transmission pole there. So we total up the cost of the infrastructure, the physical elements that make up the electricity grid, the cost of the plants that we have to generate the electricity, and the costs of the fuel that go into the plants so that we can burn or manipulate them in some way in order to create steam and turn turbines. And we add in the cost of operating all of that infrastructure, those plants, those systems, maintaining them, ensuring that vegetation is not knocking down wires and all those sorts of things. Then we get the total cost of operating the utility. And if we divide that total cost by the number of customers, which is on the bottom there, we essentially arrive at what is called the rate at which we charge for individuals to consume electricity. So that rate is essentially based on that equation. There's a little bit more to it, but that's the fundamentals of it. And the total cost of operating the system, which is a major factor here in determining the rate, is something that we have to prove on an annual basis to the regulator. So we would literally go in front of the regulator and bring information about the total cost of operation of all of these elements, and we provide evidence for those costs, and that's evaluated by a regulator in determining the overall rate of the system. So that's a fundamental. So 100 years into this system, established in 1920 for satisfying the demand, the total electric use, by building plants, poles, wires, substations, and operating this on behalf of the people, has resulted in this amazing electrical system which exists in New Brunswick. And we've got about 400,000 customers, about 21,000 kilometers of distribution lines, and another 8,000 kilometers of transmission lines. And envy of many jurisdictions because it's been built very solidly. We have a loop, a double loop that goes around the province, which is great for reliability. And we have built very strong interconnects between New Brunswick and neighboring jurisdictions. And in 300 years of understanding electricity and manipulating it on behalf of the people, although scientifically or theoretically we can transmit it wirelessly, and that's been possible for probably about 70 years, although it's not economical yet today. In order to transmit electricity, we need poles and wires. And therefore, it's very important to note that New Brunswick, although we're economically disadvantaged from an electricity perspective and from an infrastructure perspective, we are very, very well situated in the region. So those people producing electricity in our neighboring jurisdictions like Quebec and Newfoundland, particularly from hydro reserves up north of New Brunswick in Newfoundland and Labrador, in order to get that electricity that's produced down into the eastern seaboard of the United States, where there's a huge demand for electricity, in many cases they need to wheel that electricity through our province, which gives us an economic advantage because of our geographical location. And our system has been designed to have strong interconnects between ourselves and neighboring jurisdictions to allow the flow of that electricity. And that can literally mean millions of dollars of revenue opportunity for the province as a whole, which keeps our costs in control and ultimately allows us to have one of the lowest rates for electricity in the world. We'd be probably in the top 5 to 10 jurisdictions in the world. In Canada, we're about number 4, and the only people that produce electricity cheaper than us in New Brunswick here would be Quebec and Manitoba because of their large hydro reserves.
Brad,
So
we have a question from one of the attendees asking if these numbers are from 2016.
they are from 2015.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to shift. So that's a little bit of the background and context about how, and I would say this way, why were utilities created? Why was the New Brunswick Electric Power Commission created? And what was the fundamental operating paradigm on which it was established? And that, total cost of service delivery was a major element of the checks and balances that underlie the economics of providing a utility service. And, but as Quest has mentioned, and certainly even this morning at the opening of this address, the subject matter about the changing world of energy is all around us. And utilities have been working with the people, but who knows what's in the future for sure. We believe, certainly at NB Power, we believe that this amazing infrastructure that has been built on behalf of the people is still going to underpin society for a period of time. How long that is, we don't know for sure, but we think that the assets that have been invested in, that we are still paying for, after all this time, and we've built up a fair bit of debt in order to borrow money for those assets that make up the infrastructure system. We think that this is going to be in place for a period of time in order to transition to the new world that is out there, which I'm going to describe in these paradigm shifts. So I'm going to talk about 4 of these of the 5 that are on this slide because they're the most pertinent ones. But the first one I'm going to talk about a little bit is this thing called our underlying business model. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have largely been infrastructure builders and asset owners. So we have purchased assets, physical assets, on behalf of the people and built infrastructure. And essentially the underlying business model has been one of what we call return on assets, where we buy assets, we put them in the ground, and we sweat the equity in them. So we try to maximize the overall utility of those assets to maximize the return from that investment. So that model has been prevalent for about 100 years. But the reality that we're seeing now, and as we go through these paradigm shifts, hopefully it'll all come together, you'll see the total picture. But the reality that we're seeing now is that return on assets model is starting to fail. And one of the reasons it's starting to fail is because of the changes in the demographics of the province, which I'll get to here in just a second. So utilities like NB Power, and there's many that are kind of like us. In the world of utilities, we're kind of a mid-sized utility. There's many, many small utilities in the United States. Some of them are privately owned, some are owned by governments or the people. They could be cooperatives, etc. There's different kind of underlying ownership mechanisms. But for utilities like NB Power, one thing that we see happening to our business model is it's going to shift from a pure return on assets model to one that actually competes in the marketplace for electricity services. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that here as we go through the next few slides. So just hang tight for a second. So one of the important elements of the changing business model that's important to understand is that the return on assets model that we've had for the last 100 years has been predicated on the fact that our population has grown dramatically from about 150,000 people to 750,000 people in about a 100-year period. And so the return on assets business model, where you're investing in assets and building things, that works really well when the number of customers that you have are growing. And so if you look at the equation, so as the number of customers grows, that's a good thing because that means we can balance the economics of the equation. But the reality in New Brunswick is that we have essentially a flatline population, perhaps a population decline over the next 40, 50 years planned. Now that may change depending on how the government promotes people moving here and that sort of thing. But for the most part, we're anticipating that the load on the system represented by the people is going to decline. And if the load declines on the system, then our economic model, which is based on people paying for electricity based on how much they consume, that is going to decline in the future. And that puts pressure on operating the utility. And historically, the only alternative that we have had when we've had pressure from generating enough revenue in order to maintain the system that we do have is to increase the rate. So historically, that's been the model that we have used in our return on assets model, is to ask for rate increases in order to balance the equation that's on that slide. I mentioned that the model that underpins this return on assets model is one of consumption, which is shown on the left-hand side. So we literally produce electricity, send it down wires, and through a meter on the wall of a house. And in the first 100 years, we never really cared what went on inside the house. All we cared about was the consumption total, the total number of electrons that went through the meter, the total amount of electricity, and we would total that up and send you a bill for that. That revenue model, there's a paradigm shift around with it as well. So here in New Brunswick, we've never really cared much about what you did with electricity, or what our customers did with electricity, nor what time of day they were using it for. So it was basically whenever you used electricity and how much you used, we didn't care, just that we send a bill for the total amount. Utilities around the world are slowly shifting from a consumption-based model to what we call a demand-based model, which is based on something called time of use rates. So this is where people pay for electricity based on the time of day it's used, and you typically pay more when the load on the system is the highest, because we tend to use more of our assets, more of our generating plants in order to generate electrons during the peak periods of the day. And so the theory is that if you charge more for the peak periods of the day, then you can control the total demand on the system, and that's how you would get compensate for revenue. This equation is not perfect though, and again, these are paradigm shifts that are going on in the industry. We're currently not doing this in New Brunswick, but this is a direction that the world of utilities is tending to head. And one of the interesting things, and Quest would be a great organization to understand and explain this for people attending the webinar today that have more questions about this, but one of the facts of electricity is that 40% of the rate that you pay for electricity is based on the cost of the fuel that we burn in the plants to generate the steam, to turn the turbines, and create the electric flow. So 40% of the rate, I'll say that again, 40% of the rate is based on the cost of the fuel that we burn in those plants. And moving forward, one of these paradigm shifts is that as we move to more renewable-based resources, so whether it's hydro or solar or biomass facilities or wind systems, the cost of fuel in those systems goes down because the fuel tends to be free. So there's downward pressure on the rate for the utility as we move to more renewable-based systems. And of course we want to do this, and in many cases we're either being regulated or the federal government is establishing standards and programs that we need to follow. But the downward pressure on the rate from the lowering of the cost of fuel is a challenge for the utility because ultimately impacts overall revenue, and there's downward pressure on the rate kind of at a time when we can least afford it. So that's one of the economic realities facing utilities that we're trying to deal with. So these business models for utilities, again, the historic return on assets model is shifting from today's historic way of doing things, simply looking at a return on assets approach, to a future where it's possible for electricity to be provided by other people. And the business model is, that we are looking at going to the future, as all utilities are a gamut of possibilities. From on the left-hand side, where we would actually do nothing, i.e. don't change the business model that we have, which essentially would mean was we are going to let the utility come to the end of its natural life by allowing the assets that make up the system to be played out until their natural end of life. That's certainly a business model that many utilities are following, and it's a possible way to go. Another at the far right is the other extreme, where the utility becomes a market competitor and competes with other people that are producing electricity from other sources other than historically what we've generated from plants. And this, on the right-hand side, this market competitiveness type business model is very much a reality in the world around us, where it is possible now for our very own customers to produce their own electricity by using solar panels, small-scale wind farms, biomass facilities, etc. So people can produce their own electricity, and in that sense don't need the utility to produce it for them. Or maybe there's a transition period of time where the utility provides either backup electricity or supplemental electricity for those who can't produce all that's needed for their own needs. But we do know, and the reality is, and the evidence is overwhelming, that the reality of people being able to produce electricity from particularly renewables-based is a challenge facing the utility, and it's also an opportunity for society as a whole. And of course, we want to be realistic about that, and very much are understanding that this is the way the world is going. In the middle, there's a model there called platform provider, and one of the possible models out there that some utilities are considering is that they continue to provide the infrastructure on which the electricity is transmitted from point to point, but new market entrants, whether it's individual residential customers or larger entities that are producing electricity, can access the grid in order to ship that energy around from point to point, like we have over the last 100 years, and perhaps they pay some sort of a toll in order to get the electricity onto the grid and take advantage of the infrastructure assets that have been put there on behalf of society over time. So we see this business model paradigm shifting going forward. Where exactly NB Power is going to play, we don't know for sure, but it's very unlikely that we'll do nothing. We'll probably move somewhere between the yellow and the green bubble here somewhere. Next paradigm shift I want to touch on is the changing of the science of electricity, and this is perhaps where we have some very, very exciting opportunities for the world around us. And this one, I don't really have slides on it because I think it's so well understood now in many respects that there are new ways of generating electricity and there's new ways of storing electricity. And so when we talk about energy generation, think about solar panels, again, biomass facilities, our ability to harness the wind. Here in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and this region, generally speaking, we're looking at tidal power as an alternative, small-scale nuclear facilities, etc. There's just a myriad of scientific advances that are enabling new ways of generating electricity in very economical ways. And that's enabling the emergence of a marketplace for energy that's generated by entities other than the utility. So it's a very exciting opportunity and very much the world that is emerging around the utility. There's also new ways of storing electricity. And one of the realities of electricity in the first 100 years of our lives is that when you generate electricity, you either use it immediately or it's lost. We've never figured out how to store electricity in large scale until recently. And so therefore, we don't have a way of generating electricity. Historically, we have not had a way of generating electricity and storing it up for long periods of time, and then perhaps offsetting the need to use electricity from generating plants that operate only during peak periods by tapping into storage resources. We've never really been able to do that. But we do know dramatically, and the scientific advancements in storing energy in large scale is happening in real time around us, and there's some very exciting developments that are going to change the paradigm of how we generate and serve electrons or electricity to our customers on a go-forward basis. One of the realities, and I kind of touched on this a little bit here a minute ago, and I'll just explain this a little bit more, that our traditional utility model involves generating electrons on the left-hand side of this page from a large kind of monolithic generation plant through a transmission and a distribution system. We need the transmission system because when we generate electrons and we put them on a wire and they transmit along that wire, they lose energy as they travel over distance. And so therefore, when we generate electrons, we have to boost up the voltage, we call it, the energy in those electrons in order for them to transmit over long distances. Why are we doing that? Well, we generally have sited our generation plants, typically not exactly where the people are. And think about that for a second. We have to site hydro plants and things like that on a run-of-river or where there's water. We built our nuclear facility kind of outside of a populous area because the dangers associated with nuclear and the fact that it needs to be on water if it needs to be cooled down, etc. So we need that transmission system in order to transmit the electrons over long distance from where they're created to where they're used. And because the voltage has to be very high on the transmission system, we need substations in order to lower the voltage back down to what's the right amount of energy that's used in the wall outlets of our homes and businesses, and that's what our distribution system does. And when those electrons that are transmitting along those wires in the form of electricity arrive at your house or your business, they go through the meter on the wall, and that flow of electrons historically has been unidirectional from where they're generated along the wires to they go through the meter on your house. Now, there's a concept in the industry that's referred to as smart grid. And smart grid is kind of a bit of a misnomer in some ways, but it refers to a concept that on a new electric grid, which we are working on here in New Brunswick, and we've kind of been trying to modernize our grid over the last 5 years, the concept of smart grid is that you can flow electrons in two directions. Now, technically, this has been possible forever, that electrons can flow in multiple directions on a wire. What this is really referring to in the industry, smart grid, is the ability for customers to generate electricity and put that electricity back onto the system. So our system was not designed to do that. It was designed to flow electrons from a generator through a meter on a wall into a house, but not to flow in the opposite direction, at least not. So smart grid is really about providing the capability on our grid to allow independent customers, or they could be residential customers or businesses, to create electricity en masse or in scale and connect that electricity source to the grid, and the grid can handle it. So that's kind of the first part of what smart grid is all about. And the second part of smart grid is that in the past, we never were really that interested in what these electrons were being used for, or what they're doing. But now we have great interest in what electrons are being used for, and I'll get to that in just a second why that is. But we are now, with smart grid, we're able to pass along the network information about what the electrons are actually doing and what they're being used for. And this gives insight into the better operation of the system. And let me give you a couple of examples of that. I'm going to begin by explaining this concept by just pointing out this amazing thing called a smartwatch, or a health watch, or whatever you might want to call it. This is a Fitbit. Many people have these things. I'm sure you're quite familiar with them. It's essentially a device you connect to your arm. It has a number of sensors in it, and those sensors are able to monitor in real time all kinds of things that are happening to you in terms of your health, heart rate, temperature, elevation, activity levels, essentially, and they provide that information to you, and you have better information about how your body is working. Homes and businesses today are being also instrumented with these types of sensor-based devices, and they're being offered in our stores around us. Think of the Home Depots, Best Buys, Canadian Tires, Home Hardwares. All these stores are offering these types of products and services, which allow you to instrument your working environment or your home with devices that collect real-time information about how electricity is being used, or how energy is being used more generally. Why are people doing this? Well, because they're looking for insights as to how can I lower my consumption, i.e. lower my bill for electricity or energy, generally speaking, or they're trying to find out how can I lower my impact on climate change. So they're kind of motivated environmentally or economically in order to have greater insight into their energy use. And one way of doing this is instrumenting homes in order to do this. And so we're seeing this more and more as we go into the future. And this is part of smart grid. So in order for us to connect to homes and tap into this type of information so that we can better manage the grid on behalf of people, then we need to be able to access this type of information. And this is what smart grid is kind of all about. One of the things that perhaps give you a little bit of insight when I talk about understanding this electric use in more detail beyond the meter, it can be illustrated by a relatively simple problem. So on this graph that I'm showing now, you can see that 24-hour period in the electric use in our province. We have a morning peak when everybody gets up in the morning and starts using electricity, typically for showers. They're using hot water, or they're using toasters, or cooking on a stove or whatever. And then again in the evening, there's another peak when people come home from work and they start cooking and washing clothes, watching TV, computer, entertainment, all that kind of stuff. And our system has been designed in order to serve those peaks. So the Electricity Act from 1920 says that we must serve electricity at all times during the day, and that includes these peak periods. So we've designed our system and our generation plants in order to be able to serve these peak loads. And as we move forward, it becomes expensive to operate these plants that are only typically used during the peak periods of time. So we've been looking for ways in order to shift energy from peak periods of time to non-peak periods of time to smooth out that curve as shown by that red line in the middle. If we could do that, we could make more economical use of our assets that we have been managing on behalf of the people. So one of the things we've been working on for about 5 years is to implement strategies for shifting energy from peak periods of time to non-peak periods of time. So let me give you an example of how we do that. So here in New Brunswick, we own about 260,000 water heaters or water tanks that provide hot water for customers around the province. Those water tanks use electricity in order to heat up the water. And for the most part, those water tanks are not very smart. So when you get up in the morning, starting as early as 5 a.m. and then until about 9 o'clock in the morning, people get up and take showers. And as the tanks get depleted of water, new water needs to come into the tank and it needs to be heated up. And that causes one of the spikes of peak energy use in the morning. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to make those water tanks smarter so that they don't necessarily heat energy during the peak period of time, but they heat it before and after the peak period of time. So it turns out that water will stay hot in a tank for a long period of time. So just when you deplete the water tank of water, you don't really need to heat it up right away because for the most part, after you take a shower, you go to work and you're not using that water tank again for many hours, 8 or 9 hours. So if we could shift the time period from when that tank is heating water to later in the day, we could smooth out the curve through that peak. And the way we're doing that is using the principles of smart grid in order to make water tanks smarter by putting a control system on the water tanks and communicating with that device using something called a virtual power plant. So a virtual power plant, illustrated by the computer monitor on the left-hand side, can send a message through a series of networks across the telecommunication network and send a message to a water tank telling it to don't heat now, heat later in the day. This, and we've proven that we can do this with no change in comfort level to the user. So in other words, no one actually runs out of hot water, but we make a smarter use of when the energy is being used to heat the water in that tank. We can use that, we can accomplish that using this virtual power plant technology. This is a prime example of how a smart grid can be used to more proactively manage energy that's on our grid and do it for economic benefit of all users of the system. That virtual power plant can control all kinds of different things. It can control heat in homes, heat in water tanks, or it can, on your behalf, as you learn how to manage your home with these new types of devices, you can control all kinds of things, lighting, stoves coming off and on, it could be blinds going up and down on windows. There's all kinds of things that you can do remotely using software-controlled systems that ultimately manage energy or things that consume energy in your house. So maybe just, I'm almost done here, maybe just a couple more minutes. And that is the last subject matter around changing customers. So in the first 100 years, we've had relatively passive aware, customers that are passively aware of the electricity system. And by the good work of Quest and many other organizations, the literacy level around energy is rising dramatically. And one of the reasons for this, as I mentioned before, is that customers are motivated either economically or environmentally to change the way that they use energy. And the rise of community energy programs and so forth is very much part of this. So what we're seeing is customers that have moved from being passively aware of electricity to being active participants in the management of electricity. And we actually see the emergence now of a very interesting energy value chain. Whereas historically, we were at the center of this chain, now we are joined in the management and creation of electricity by a whole plethora of new energy participants in an extended value chain. And the customer, of course, is at the center of that. The reality for NB Power is that we're no longer a monopoly. Customers are more educated, they're technically savvy, they want new tools, new mechanisms for managing energy on their behalf, and also to improve society's positioning with climate change as an example, and they want to make a contribution to that. One way that we are participating with our customers is starting to educate them as well. We started a program called Smart Habits a couple of years ago to encourage people to use less electricity, which sounds like a bit of a strange thing for a utility that's selling electricity, but the reality is that we know that this is important for society. We know it's important for climate change, and this is what our customers are asking for. How can I better control energy so that I can lower my bills and I can lower my impact on climate change? In addition, if we don't use as much electricity, we can avoid having to build new monolithic, expensive power plants in the future. Those are based on physical assets that have natural lifespans that are coming to an end. And as we go forward, we'll be able to avoid building new plants if we can encourage people to use less of our product. So that could be around water tanks and water heaters, and just better understanding how a meter is influencing day-to-day operation. That wonderful information source about how energy is being used, and those sensors that are going into devices. Just a couple of slides left here. Innovation opportunities abound in this changing world. This is a bit of a utility-centric view of the world, but we see that smart grid infrastructure is the foundation which enable our entire society to live and move forward in the world of electricity as it's unfolding in the society around us. So those innovation opportunities exist at the device level, within buildings, neighborhoods, communities, and cities. And certainly Quest and partners that Quest would have that are rolling out programs, particularly at the city and community level, are part and parcel of making this whole new world of electricity infrastructure valuable to everybody around us. We have kind of two major things we've been working on the last 5 years. 60% of the efforts that we're working on are in the areas of energy efficiency, so encouraging people to use less electrons or less electricity through behavioral change, energy efficient products, or adopting things like municipal programs for roadway lighting and moving to LED road lights, which are much more economical. And 40% of our effort is establishing the ability to control devices, smart devices, in homes and businesses in order to shift energy between peak periods and non-peak periods of time. For example, the water heaters or thermostats in homes which are controlling heat. So that's kind of a soup to nuts explanation of the history of the utility, some of the paradigm shifts that we see that are driving us to become a utility of the future and changing the way they interact with our customers, providing more products and services, efficiency programs, and helping to build literacy as a new marketplace for energy-related products and services emerging around the utility, and we switch our business model to whatever it's going to be in the future, which is going to be one that's going to respect the reality that there's a new world of electricity out there that we need to take part in.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Brad. That was a really great presentation. I'm going to be unmuting the participants here so that if anyone has any questions, go ahead and ask them. And if it's taking time for you to be able to get the sound through, you can also just send us a text in the chat box and we can respond that way. Does anyone have any questions? I see one coming through here. Oh,
Testing.
I can hear you, Eddie.
Testing.
Yes, I can hear someone.
Okay, it's Theo here. I just want to make sure that that everybody hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I've got a question for Brad. Did you ever thought of diminishing the demand by having biomass to heat the houses? Like
so I think maybe I can just repeat the question. I think the question was about the potential for biomass to be an energy source to create electrons or electricity in order to heat homes, for example. Absolutely, that is for sure a a great potential, particularly here in New Brunswick, because biomass could come from forest product or from some of the natural resources that we have in the province. We do have some biomass facilities already. We do think it's an untapped potential and one that should be explored more in the future.
What about the power plant in Beldoon? Instead of bringing coal, what about burning wood pellets?
Yeah, so alternative fuels is that's a great subject matter. There's a fair bit of complexity to the whole subject matter about converting plants from one fuel source to another. But so I would say this, that the concept is not new. I mean, it's been certainly it's been brought up before. Whether we're going to do that, I don't see us doing that with Beldoon in the short term for sure, because there's a lot of economics associated with the cost of fuels that we're burning there in that plant today. But long term, absolutely, this idea of using biomass fuels for generating electricity is absolutely a part of the future.
We also have a question that came through on the chat asking, where is NB Power in achieving the 2020 objectives?
Okay, I assume that's referring to the intention to get to 40% renewables on the grid. We're very close now. We're fully intending to hit that target. We're about 34 to 35%, I think, today is the last I've heard. And we absolutely hit that 40% target by 2020.
There aren't any other questions at the moment on the chat. Does anyone else have any questions for Brad? I guess that sounds like it's the end of the questions. Oh, okay, Eddie.
I might as well jump in here. Thank you, Brad. I wonder if you could elaborate on the 60-40 efficiency and smart grid, and how do you see municipalities playing a role in their planning efforts and technology implementation, and over what time period is this transition going to take place?
Good question. So the 60-40 split, that's our as you mentioned, I think referring to the 60% of the effort it would be on energy efficiency programs and 40% on load shifting programs. So this is associated with the target that we have with by 2035 to essentially have removed about 609 megawatts of energy from our total consumption pattern in the province. 40% of that target would be hit by using energy efficiency programs, and 60% from energy efficiency and 40% from load shifting programs. So the second part of the question is that target, 609 megawatts approximately by 2035, we will require the municipalities and communities to participate in our programs in order to achieve those targets. So energy efficiency programs, as an example that we're rolling out, will require communities to hopefully get on board with us and promote these programs in their communities. In addition, the load shifting programs will require and are assumed to be that energy management in buildings, particularly large buildings that form many of the communities in New Brunswick, whether it's schools or hospitals or other large building entities, will participate in these load shifting programs with us. In fact, in some instances, they may be managed directly by communities as this unfolds. So we absolutely see a partnership with communities as essential for us to hit our targets going forward. And a lot of the work that Michel Logier is doing is forging those relationships with communities to try and make this viable in the future.
Thank you very much, Brad.
You're welcome.
Christy,
I've got another question. What will be the effect of the carbon tax coming up in 2018 in regards to the power rate that you're going to have to increase to minimize or to come up to that carbon tax?
So that's a great question, and unfortunately I don't have an answer directly for you because we're still trying to figure that out ourselves. So we're trying to understand the relationship between all the parameters here that are involved with that carbon, carbon emission standards that are going to be set. What's the impact on, the major contributions to that, which is certainly burning fuel in plants, but it includes transportation and other, building use of energy, etc. Unfortunately, I can't answer the question for you now because we are also reading through those climate change plans and standards that are coming out and trying to figure out how do we have to play into that in the future. We do know it's going to be a major focus of our attention going forward. It is one of the major underlying factors changing utility operations. That's going to be in the next 10, 20 years certainly in our lifetimes.
Okay, so we are just after 12 o'clock. We do have one more question that came through. Brad, are you all right to answer this question and then we'll wrap up the webinar?
Sure.
Okay, it says that you talk about managing energy in large buildings. Does this mean that the NB Power business model is changing?
So yeah, absolutely, our business model is changing, but I don't want to misconstrue that in the sense that managing an energy in buildings, there's already quite an industry for building management systems and environmental management around buildings, within buildings, strategies for doing so, etc. I would certainly not say, the intention here would be to collectively partner with ways of managing energy for overall grid benefit. And that serves both the private sector industry that's already playing in this space and for the utility to reap the benefits of better energy management, particularly during peak periods of time. So whether that means that we actually have to instrument buildings to do so, that's an open question, but I would say there's already quite an industry that's playing in this space, so partnering and working together is probably the path forward.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Brad, and thank you, Eddie, for joining us on this webinar, and thank you everyone else for participating and for your questions.